Trump has made a pretty big announcement today. It is what Politico and other outlets were reporting on Thursday, going on to Friday, as rumors started to spread that the President of the United States was going forward with a plan to allow European nations to buy American munitions and then transfer those munitions to the Ukrainians instead of what was the previous admin's strategy, which was supplemental aid packages of the double-digit billions of dollars to try to speed artillery shells, anti-air munitions, and Bradleys and other desperately needed munitions and equipment to the Ukrainian armed forces. This purchasing effort put forward by Donald Trump is the first major action and pathway for weapons to get to Ukraine since he has been elected. Donald Trump, in his 175 days in office, has sent no aid packages to the Ukrainians. He has approved no new aid packages with the $3.8 billion that is sitting in the Presidential Drawdown Authority that he could have pulled from at any point. There was a rumor over the weekend that in the near future he might pull $300 million, according to sources near the administration, from that authority and send it to the Ukrainians, but we have yet to hear that publicly commented on by the Trump administration. So far, all we have is this new pathway for weapons. And so, how is this supposed to work? Well, let's try to describe it as simply as possible. So, a source familiar with this is saying that it's going to be $10 billion. $10 billion in what NATO allies are calling the first wave. Now, whether there's going to be a second wave or after this it becomes a puddle, I do not know. We need to understand the geopolitical uncertainty we are dealing with in this era of American foreign policy. And with this administration when it comes to supplying aid to Ukraine. As of 7 or 8 days ago, the official policy of the administration was that aid to Ukraine is to be frozen because we are of such a shortage of munitions that we have to stop it while it is being loaded into the trucks to cross the border from Poland, from the city of Lublin, over the border into Lviv. We need to freeze that. There was thousands of artillery shells, GLMRS rockets that were waiting on the border, Patriot missiles that were frozen by what we're now finding out was Pete Hegseth, who acted without the knowledge of the presidency. Then that was flipped back once the president, who argued very much that he would not be undermined this time around from the office of the presidency, he then reversed that decision and he allowed most of the aid that was being held on the border, the artillery shells, the GLMRS rockets, to go through. He gave 10 of the 30 Patriot interceptors. He allowed those to go. So not all of them, but at least some of them. And now we have a deal where we're talking about $10 billion worth of weapons being sent over in one wave. I mean, if a few thousand artillery shells on the border is enough to cause we got to freeze, going from that to $10 billion worth of weapons is quite the transformation for like a 10-day period, isn't it? It's quite a change. And I think partially this needs to be seen as, due to the fault of Pete Hegseth undermining the president of the United States during high-profile negotiations, where he's undermining the American position, but making us seem uninterested in Ukraine to the point where, even though the Joint Staff said the munitions that were frozen, we were not at a critical point. And when we're talking about GLMRS rockets or the 155 artillery shells, we're certainly not near a critical point. There's a question of the presidency being undermined, and there's also a second question of Donald Trump just getting frustrated with the Russians, which we'll talk about in a second. But first, here is Donald Trump explaining exactly what the plan is. And he's emphasizing exactly what I thought he would and why I thought if we were to advance, and we said this since day one of this administration, I believe we talked about this even before Trump was inaugurated, that the best pathway for there to continue to be weapon shipments to Ukraine is for the pitch to be Biden sold out our country. He gave them aid. I gave them weapons in weapons deals. I sold them I made us money, and it's not as much our war because we have this area of separation between us, and the war, the selling of weapons. Now, the first half of that, the selling of weapons to Ukraine, I thought leaning into that would be big for Trump, and he does lean into that because it allows him to say, look, I wasn't getting ripped off like Biden. That was my problem with Biden's policy towards Ukraine. We were getting ripped off. But the second part, the fact that he's sending these weapons to Europe and then Europe sends it over, also gives him some level of separation from the war. And maybe he thinks that he can continue to call it Biden's war that way. Maybe it's purely to help coordinate with NATO when it comes to getting these weapons to Ukraine. I don't know, but either way, he is heavily leaning into the weapon sale part of this, which does not surprise me at all. We predicted this a while ago.
And we make the best equipment, the best missiles, the best of everything. The European nations know that. And we've made a deal today, and I'm going to have Mark speak about it, but we've made a deal today where we are going to be sending them weapons and they're going to be paying for them. The United States will not be having any payment made. We're not buying it, but we will manufacture it and they're going to be paying for it. Our last meeting of a month ago was very successful in that they agreed to 5%, which is more than $1 trillion a year, so they have a lot of money. And these are wealthy nations. They have a lot of money, and they want to do it. They feel very strongly about it, and we feel strongly about it, too. But we're in for a lot of money, and we don't want to do anymore, and we can't. But we make the best, and we're going to be sending the best to NATO, and in some cases to maybe, at Mark's suggestion, if we go to Germany, where they're going to send early on missiles, and they'll be replaced, and NATO is going to take care of it. It's going to be coordinated by NATO, and they're going to work very much with Matt Whitaker, who's right here, who's a great...
By the way, I will say, whether or not the fact that it's being coordinated by NATO to add a level of separation for the fact that it'll probably be better if it's coordinated by NATO, it being coordinated by NATO is good because I think it does add a level of stability to the inflow.
Ambassador, and Matt's going to be coordinating. You better do a good job, Matt.
I will.
But Matt's going to coordinate. He's a very talented guy. He's going to coordinate everything. So in a nutshell, we're going to make top-of-the-line weapons, and they'll be sent to NATO. NATO may choose to have certain of them sent to other countries where we can get a little additional speed, where the country will release something and it'll be mostly in the form of a replacement.
So $10 billion in a new weapons deal to NATO. And these weapons, for all intents and purposes, are going to be going to NATO, managed by NATO, and then sent to Ukraine. And what I'm learning is mostly we're talking about things like artillery shells. We're talking about things like Patriot interceptors, which of course have been a hot button topic. Nothing including long range missiles. So it's going to be stuff that the president has advertised as quote unquote defensive weapons, even though of course, a guy attacks you, you got to use a shell to defend it. It is defensive in that way, but it's not defensive in the same idea that we were talking about defensive weapons back in 2015 when President Obama was giving them radars so they could detect where they were getting bombed from, but not have the munitions to, do something about them being bombed, so to speak. So this is a significant shift from the president of the United States. This is a shift very quickly, considering that we just had the aid frozen not too long ago. And so the question, of course, is arising before we talk about what the effects of this will be and what the long-term stability could or could not be when it comes to whether or not the American government is going to stick with this. How did Trump get here from 12 days ago? Aid was being frozen. Well, actually, before we do that, I forgot. I did want to say this. There's two things I got to say before that. Number one, during this, there was one moment that I do need to correct. Trump said that there's a country with 17 Patriots getting ready to be shipped to Ukraine. This is not true. I'm seeing people report this as if like, oh, wow, oh my gosh, Ukraine asked for 10 Patriots. Now they're getting 17. Oh, my God. I honestly, and this is just my intuition, and I know I'm right, so I'm just going to say it. What he's thinking about probably is launchers. that there's a country with 17 Patriot launchers, which are part of a Patriot system, which go from 4 to 8 systems. I mean, 4 to 8 launchers per system. There's probably a country with 3 or 4 systems that each have 4 to 8 launchers. And that's what he's talking about here. That's the first thing. And the second thing, before we talk about why Biden's making this shift, I had a Biden moment. Before why Trump's making this shift, I wanted to show you this clip of when Trump was announcing that aid was going to be unfrozen. Because I do want to just throw out there that this weapons deal is probably not coming without detractors within the administration. This has been an internal fight. And when Trump was announcing this, on the left here is Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who did the freeze without the president's say. And to the right of him is CIA Director Ratcliffe. And this MAGA account zoomed in on their faces to show the reactions when aid was being reannounced. And there's a very different vibe on both of them.
Are you planning to send more weapons to Ukraine?
We're going to send some more weapons. We have to. They have to be able to defend themselves. They're getting hit very hard now. They're getting hit very hard. We're going to have to send more weapons. Yeah, defensive weapons primarily, but they're getting hit very, very hard.
I can read so much and so little there, honestly. So what is making Trump change his mind? Why is Trump changing his mind? Why is the administration going back to not only unfreezing the aid, but now a $10 billion weapons deal? Well, first, let's start with geopolitics and not with, Trump specifically. Russia is escalating the war, and to escalate the war, he is working with a lot of America's enemies. One example of this that I'll just give attention to now, even though there's other examples as well, has to be North Korea. North Korea is sending 25,000 workers to work in Russian factories to produce shaheeds. That knowledge is going to be brought back to North Korea. The North Koreans are sending 30,000 more soldiers to North Korea to be utilized in the war against Ukraine. They've already sent thousands of soldiers for some period covertly to the Russian armed forces to fight the Ukrainians in Kursk. They have provided to the Russians with a very, very significant portion of their artillery supply. And when I say very significant portion, there have been estimates put out there between 30% to 40%, and even some at nearing like 50%. But the most recent prediction I saw put out by Ukrainian intelligence was 40%. Whether it's 30%, whether it's 50%, whether it's 40%, doesn't really matter. It could be 20%, and that's still a massive amount of ammunition that is being supplied to the Russian armed forces, that without it, it would be much harder for their artillery guns to keep firing. They haven't only gotten the artillery from them, they've also gotten the artillery systems. They've gotten short-range Model 73 rocket launchers, and they've also gotten artillery guns themselves, quite large artillery guns. And so with all of this, and with North Korean factories reportedly working 24/7 to keep up the production to hoist up the Russian war effort, that doesn't come with no reciprocal benefit. For the North Koreans, that reciprocal benefit has been seen in Pantsir air defense systems on their ships. That could have possibly been seen in the speed of their ship production, which was markedly faster than a Chinese ship production when it comes to them putting their boats out to water, even if they had to be brought around by tugboats quite recently. This also comes probably when it comes to like vital national staples that they need to stay afloat, like food and stuff like that. I saw some goats and like other type of food items from Russia going to North Korea. But what I think is probably most worrying for American defense planners is, number one, the long-range missile technology that the Russians could provide the North Koreans to assist their ICBM program, making it easier for them to strike the continental United States and the United States territories, as well as America's allies, as well as knowledge when it comes to long-range drone programs. Because if those North Korean workers go to Russia and they come back one day, which presumably they will, they're going to be bringing back all of that production knowledge with them. And so I think that it's not just a question of calculating whether or not Russia poses a threat to European security and by an extension, American security, NATO security, economically, or because of, our big economic relationship with the Europeans, or militarily, because of our deep integration militarily and alliance structure with the Europeans. Whether or not Russia itself poses a threat to the United States itself, like whether or not the Russians have goals beyond Ukraine, whether or not the Russians are not willing to accept a deal right now. These are all things that are pretty obviously, I think, true. Uh, Now, the question of like the size of threat can be debated, but they are also assisting a lot of America's geopolitical foes that also is unavoidably Donald Trump's geopolitical foes. For example, Donald Trump tried really hard in his negotiations, for Trump, of course, to get them to agree to give up their nuclear weapons program. He wanted to have that achievement on his record. And now we have Sergei Lavrov saying Russia understands the reasons why North Korea is developing its nuclear weapons and respects its position. This is something that, whether or not you're Donald Trump, Joe Biden, is untenable for America's long-standing position on the Korean Peninsula, the possession of North Korean atomic weapons. Is there a certain level of they have atomic weapons? We have to accept they have atomic weapons for the time being when it comes to military peer-to-peer communication? Yes, but that doesn't mean that there's official like respect towards that or acknowledgement that, yeah, they're going to have that forever and that's okay. And, there's not going to be penalties for that. Due to the encouragement that could mean for other states, as well as the fact that the United States still has the official position of wanting to retain leverage to get them to give up those atomic weapons, and that is the position of the majority of the international community as well. And Russia is the one sticking out its neck in a way, almost more than the Chinese. I wouldn't even say more than the Chinese here when putting out positions like this. So there's a question of Russia assisting America's opponents in other ways. This also, of course, extends to China, not just North Korea, as China has been a big economic support for the Russian war effort. So I think that there's a certain amount of it's pretty clear that the North Koreans are going to deepen these relationships further, and that's problematic to the United States. I think partially it's that the Russians clearly are not treating negotiations seriously, and it's gotten to a point where even Trump cannot deny it, as he is saying publicly that, he talks to Putin one day and the conversation is pleasant. But then after, immediately cities start getting bombed. And so he starts to feel like, it's a strategy to distract. Listen.
We just hang up and say, well, that was a nice phone call. And then missiles are launched into Kiev or some other city. And I said, strange. We just hang up and say, well, that was a nice phone call. And then missiles are launched into Kiev or some other city. And I said, strange. And after that happens 3 or 4 times, you say, the talk doesn't mean anything. My conversations with him are always very pleasant. They say, isn't that a very lovely conversation? And then the missiles go off that night. I go home, I tell the First Lady, and I spoke to Vladimir today. We had a wonderful conversation. She said, oh, really? Another city was just hit. So it's like, look, he's, I don't want to say he's an assassin, but he's a tough guy. It's been proven over the years. He's fooled a lot of people. He fooled Bush. He fooled a lot of people.
I want to call the KGB agent, man, takes out his political opponents, an assassin. Don't want to do that. So I think that there is a certain level of, he can't allow this to drag on forever. Putin is frustrating him by rejecting deals that would have been quite, given the circumstances, beneficial to the Russian position when it comes to them being able to control the land that they currently have and being able to reinforce it, to the fact that it would open up business opportunities with the United States and start moving towards sanctions removal, that it would keep Ukraine outside of NATO, which, according to Russia, is one of their main demands. But no, they didn't accept it. They asked for more land. They asked for demilitarization. They asked for a bunch of things that were non-starters from the get-go. And so after 175 days of being told one thing, saying, oh, we'll do a civilian ceasefire, and then people see on the front of the New York Post dead babies that were hit in Kherson with FPVs, and that's a right-leaning outlet like that makes Trump look bad. And also it could make Trump personally feel like he's getting played if he is truly believing Putin in these moments, which of course is you have to question exactly how much Trump is putting trust into the words of Vladimir Putin during these time periods. So that's the first half of this. Before we talk about what the $10 billion could mean for Ukraine, we need to talk about the other element of this. I said on a previous program that I thought that one of the more likely scenarios for what we were going to see today, and announced because they was being hyped that there was going to be this big announcement. Lindsey Graham was on, on cable news talking about it and all this other such. I was expecting an announcement on the sanctions package. I was expecting an announcement on, we're going to move forward and we're going to implement it X, Y, or Z day during this week. Instead, we got the $10 billion weapons deal, which had, they've been reported previously that something was in the works when it comes to a transfer from Europe. And we got a new deadline when it comes to the sanctions deal or sanctions package. Trump says that he is going to put forward a 100% secondary tariff. That's what he's calling it. Don't know if he I think maybe he means secondary sanction, but secondary tariff, meaning it would be a tariff that goes onto effect on the other countries that Russia is doing business with, if he doesn't necessarily mean sanction. Either way, he's putting this economic consequence of 100% on in 50 days. That's the new deadline, 50 days. Why is there a new 50-day deadline? Why can't we just do it now? Say, hey, look, we're serious about it, and so we're going to do this. Why is it also weaker than the Senate bill? I don't know if you guys remember, but we reported on this channel after it was reported in one of the big three-letter news agencies that Donald Trump was trying to water down the sanctions package, that the 500% secondary sanctions that Blumenthal and Graham's sanction bill, which has 85 co-sponsors in the Senate, he wanted to water that down after being the guy who talked about secondary sanctions on the campaign trail. Well, now I guess this is the announcement of the watered down version that Trump wanted. Instead of 500% secondary sanctions, we're talking 100% secondary sanctions. So that is a difference of 400% compared to the Senate bill. So Trump is watering down the legislation. That's the first thing. And then after watering down the legislation, he is then putting forward another deadline, another 50-day deadline. Now, I knew a 500% secondary sanction would be quite devastating. I knew it was a quite strong, quite a strong measure. And so I always felt a certain amount of suspicion on whether or not Trump was going to go forward with this. But, of course, it is still a news update to see that he actually has officially watered that down. But 50-day deadline. I don't see the purpose of a 50-day deadline. I don't see the purpose of a 50-day deadline because the problem with the Russians is they question American commitment. They question European commitment. And so whether or not they would continue for a bit when it comes to a completely committed Europe, completely committed the United States, they need to see something before they could even begin to recalculate. Before they could even begin to recalculate, should I go forward with this war? Should I not go forward with this war? Should we keep pushing on to take on Kherson? Should we keep pushing on to take on Zaporizhia? Should we keep on pushing on to take the rest of the Donetsk region? Which, I mean, they're clearly doing that right now. So that the answer to that, yes, before they could sit down and say, this feels like a brick wall we're slamming our head into. You need to take actions. Actions like, for example, a $10 billion weapons deal. Now, I will put forward that $10 billion is still significantly less than the supplementals we saw in 2022, in 2023, and 2024 when it comes to a $24 billion supplemental here, $55 billion back in 2022. $10 billion is still a far cry away from that, but it is still something. It is pulling the trigger on something. And some rumors were even saying that we could see some of these packages arriving in the next week. I put no credibility in that, but rumors are rumors. Question is whether that's going to be enough. Especially when you say things like phase 1. Does that make the Russians calculate, okay, phase 2? But if you combine that with another deadline for the sanctions package, why not put forward the sanctions package, put forward the $10 billion, and then say, okay, this is the first phase. The next phase will be bigger. It'll be $20 billion. And the next sanctions will be, after we watered it down to 100 billion, the next one will be 250 billion in 50 days. So you show that the Russians you're serious, and then you go through with the actions. For example, Donald Trump found it necessary to put massive tariffs on many of our biggest trading partners and allies in order to get across the message on Liberation Day that he meant business. Well, this is a war. This is the thing where people are being put in the ground. So if you want to make clear that you mean business after 175 days of failed negotiating, you don't slowly slide into action. You take bold action that make clear your position, and you're going to show a sea change and what to expect from the United States. Because when you say 2-week ceasefire, 2-week deadline, 2-week deadline, 2-week deadline, oh, if we're going to pass this deadline, we're totally going to go with a sanctions package. We're going to coordinate with the Europeans. Oh, we'll get it over in 24 hours. Oh, it'll be done in the first 100 days. Oh, here's another 50 days. There's a certain amount of credibility that is being questioned. One of the things I worry about when it comes to the failure of these tariff negotiations is that with these deadlines continuing to be kicked back, with another deadline being kicked back just last week, the problem for a lot of these people trying to negotiate with the United States is when the deadline approaches and you're trying to negotiate so much. I mean, we're negotiating so much of America and these different countries' trade relationships in such a short period of time, with all these different countries at the same time. That's quite a lot to get done. When a deadline, like in August or whenever, comes up on you, and you're thinking, oh, is it real? Is it not a deadline? We still haven't gotten into steel and aluminum. We still haven't gotten into agricultural product. We still haven't gotten into the raw minerals and raw resources. We still haven't gotten into X, Y, and Z. Do you just agree to whatever Trump asked for? Do you just agree to just the broad strokes and don't get into the specifics that would benefit your country out of fear of larger retaliation? Or do you expect Taco Trump, as you know, some in the market have been calling him, Trump always chickens out? Do you expect Trump to kick the can down the road? Well, that has an effect when it comes to trade negotiating, when it comes to these countries expecting maybe they can get bailed out again by another deadline being kicked down the road. The Russians think the same way when it comes to negotiating with the United States. Oh, another 50-day deadline. We can keep pushing. And then after 50 days, we can ask them, hey, well, actually, we'll put forward this proposal. Well, we can't have peace right now, but we can have a meeting in 30 days. And so until they're made to face the reality of the situation, they can continue to be hopeful. And hope is very hard to conquer. Here is Trump explaining why he's putting 50 days on the tariff deadline. And then I'll give you some of the reasons I think we're putting down another deadline.
Any questions, Vance? Yes.
At least the reasons that the Trump administration could have convinced themselves of.
Thank you, Mr. President. What was the tipping point for you in making this decision? Was it a conversation with President Putin? Was it a piece of intelligence? And why are you giving 50 more days?
I think it's a very short period of time. I think, don't forget, I've just really been involved in this for not very long. And it wasn't initial focus. This is a Biden war. This is a Democrat war, not a Republican or Trump war. This is a war that would have never happened. It shouldn't have happened. A lot of people being killed. Any questions, please? Yes.
So emphasis, it's a Biden war. Continue to emphasize Biden war. So this talking point is going to continue to push forward. And I think, again, the weapons deal is partially a way to obfuscate his involvement in the conflict, to try to move responsibility from him as president of the United States. By the way, wars don't work. This is Biden's responsibility. It's not my responsibility. It's either the responsibility of the United States or it isn't. It doesn't shift between administrations. You need to see yourself as the caretaker of the union, not the caretaker of your personal reputation. Now, why did he give him 50 more days? Biden's war, Democrat war, it, wasn't an initial focus, quote unquote, quote unquote, quote unquote. So it seems as if Trump's almost saying, if you wanted to find something out of this besides finger pointing, as, hey, I haven't been doing this for that long. I only been in office for 175 days. Cut me some slack. It wasn't my initial focus. I guess now it is my focus, despite him saying he would have it done over in 24 hours. He advertised himself as it being his initial focus. Democrat war, Biden war. Now it's focused on it. Wasn't his initial focus. Mind you, Trump was president for 4 years while the war in the Donbass was ongoing. So he was in office in closed-door meetings with President Putin. When, for example, like that time in Helsinki when he chose to respect Putin's intelligence over American intelligence. He got time in office to measure up Putin, to learn the basics of the conflict, and he's had time outside of office, and while he was getting brought into the office, while getting intelligence reports, to figure out, oh, I understand the Russians' demand. Oh, I can see what they're doing on the ground. Oh, I think, after the first month of attempted negotiations, I see where we are. Or hell, even the negotiations before he entered the White House. But instead, he dragged this process out. The process failed. His process for peace failed, that he kept trying to trumpet around as, I'm going to end the war, I'm going to end the war, I'm going to end the war. And now, instead of claiming responsibility for his failed peace process, he instead shifts focus to it being Biden's war. Now, why 50 more days? Well, I think there's a few reasons. Number one, and this is the simplest explanation, hope. Just like for the Russians, hope is unconquerable when it comes to their maximalist demands when it in Ukraine. Hope is also unconquerable when it comes to Trump being bailed out of the crisis that we are in and being able to ignore the writing on the wall and hoping for a miracle of some sort. That in the next 50 days, the Russians will see reason in some way, or something will happen that will radically recalibrate their calculation, and they will come to the table and talk in seriousness about a peace deal, or at least a ceasefire that can be treated with some regard and not as just another period of delay. And I think that there is some part of him that is hesitant to completely abandon that window that he thinks is open between their personal relationship to bring about an end to this, even though so far that personal relationship has derived nothing on the battlefield. I mean, the civilian ceasefire did not hold. The energy ceasefire is weak. The 30-day ceasefires he's demanded has not been brought about. The personal dynamic has seen no success. So I think part of it is hope is unconquerable. I think another part of it is, even though, this might seem a little silly from the guy who feels comfortable to announce sanctions with no congressional input, if you want to see the sanctions bill reformed and then implemented, then you're going to have to see that 500% go down to 100%. So you're going to have to see that watering down get transferred legislatively. And so maybe in the Senate, they need to reform it, pass it through the House again, pass it through the Senate again. But I find that explanation hard to believe. Not because they might end up going through this process anyway, but Trump feels comfortable implementing the sanction on a country like that, like with no problem, regardless of what the lawyers say about the legality. So I find it hard to believe that all of a sudden he's going to get super trigger shy when it comes to tariffs or this type of action. But maybe there is somebody in his administration that would rather see this coordinated with the Senate. So however this goes forward, it's maybe not even Trump doing it. Trump can say, hey, it's not me, it's the Senate. Even though it's clear that he's the one that's greenlighting it, since he's the one who came out and announced this deadline. There may be a fear within the administration that they need somewhere to escalate towards, since they are all negotiation minded, since they all are trying to find a way out minded, by keeping open the idea of further sanctions, or tariffs, or however you want to call it, and passing the weapons deal now, or putting through the $10 billion weapons deal now, that leaves a future for pressure. That means you can apply more pressure later. Now, again, you can do that as well by having both a weapons deal of $10 billion in the first phase, sanctions now that are serious, and then escalating from there. Saying, look, every month that passes by, the sanction's going to go up 10%. Every month that passes by, 20%. Or hell, every month that passes by is going to go up by 10% and is going to double. First month, 10%, it goes up. Next month, 20%. Next month, 40%. something that escalates while showing you're serious by taking action at the start. But another deadline, again, I think just leaves too much room for interpretation for the Russians. There is one last explanation that could be given, and I just want to throw out there that this is still speculation, because Trump's explanation for why there's another deadline could be described as either A, 95% Biden, which was not an explanation at all, and 5%, hey, come on, we just got in here. It wasn't my initial focus, even though he said it was their initial focus. It was absolutely their initial focus. He said 24 hours. I don't know how you say 24 hours and then say it wasn't your initial focus. The other thing that is being being guessed about, being thought about, is Trump possibly interpreting a July 3rd phone call when it comes to Putin's offensive aspirations and then turning that into sanctions deadline. Here is a report from Axios. Trump has grown increasingly frustrated over the last 2 weeks over Putin's unwillingness to move towards a ceasefire and Russia's escalating attacks on Kyiv and other cities. One thing that convinced Trump to move down this path was the July 3rd phone call in which Putin made clear he planned to escalate the war. Putin indicated that over the next 60 days, he would make a renewed push to occupy territory up to the administrative lines of the Ukrainian regions in which Russia had a significant foothold. He wants to take all of it, Trump told French President Emmanuel Macron shortly after his call with Putin, according to a source with direct knowledge. Mind you, Steve Witkoff said on Tucker Carlson's show that this wasn't the case, which was Trump's handpicked negotiator with the Russians, who ended up going to Moscow and having the Russians choose his interpreter for him since he doesn't speak Russian. In the ensuing days, the weapons plan turned from an idea into something more concrete. Now let's listen to this deadline. July 3rd phone call. Putin indicated over the next 60 days he would make this renewed push. Well, this package was just announced on July 14th. That's today in the United States. So subtract 60 minus the 10 days since July 3rd, and you're at roughly like 50, 51, or 49 days until this offensive is supposed to be done, according to the bounds of this call reported by Axios. So is it possible that Trump is scheduling his implementation of sanctions for the culmination of the next 50 days of offensive operations that the Russians told him that they were going to engage in, where they presumably would try to take major locations like Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka? I don't know, but the timing of it is of note. And while coincidences do exist, we need to be on our toes, because the odds that this is a coincidence is not impossible, but also not terribly unlikely. It's not terribly unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's also not unlikely. Not saying it's likely, I'm just saying it's not unlikely. Now, just because we've seen these sea changes, just like we've seen some delay when it comes to throwing the further sanctions at the Russians, I would also expect delay when it comes to other action. I don't think it's going to be a smooth transition. Of course, Trump has taken sporadic decisions. He does like to be viewed in some amount as the wild man, even though he has not flexed that towards the Russians in many ways, outside of his stories that he tells donors of him telling them he's going to bomb Moscow, XYZ. I'm still wondering what Trump will do if these attacks on Ukrainian cities continue to escalate as is expected, and if they continue to hit civilian infrastructure in larger and larger amounts. If those headlines keep coming out on the American presses, what will the president do? Will he send a second wave? Will he speed it up, the second wave? Will he possibly take other action? Will he try to coordinate with our Asian Pacific allies like Japan and South Korea to see if they can use their artillery production to get more shells to Ukraine? What will he do? Well, Trump said that's not a good question. Don't ask questions like that. Don't bad.
If Putin escalates further, how far are you willing to go in response?
In what?
How far are you willing to go if Putin were to escalate send more bombs in the coming days?
Don't ask me a question like that. How far? I want to get the war settled. They're not Americans that are dying in it, and, you know, I have a problem, and JD has a problem. It's a stance that he's had for a long time. They're not Americans dying, but there are a lot of people dying, and on something that should be able to be settled. And we all agree with that. This group of people, you know, we want to defend our country, but, you know.
JD is one of the hardliners against aid and munitions to Ukraine within the Trump administration. That's why he's referencing JD Vance there. I remember when he was running for Senate, when he was asked whether or not he supported Ukraine, he said, "I do not care about Ukraine." And since then, when it comes to the type of policy he's taken towards the country, he has been reflective of that opinion.
Man.
JC, thank you so much for the primer. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. Now, Vladimir Zhilinsky, after this $10 billion rumored, but we know that there's a weapon deal, but sources are saying it's going to be $10 billion. After this announcement, Vladimir Zhilinsky had a phone call with the president. Here is what he had to say. "I spoke with President Trump. It was a very good conversation. Thank you for the willingness to support Ukraine and to continue working together to stop the killings and to establish a lasting and just peace." President Trump shared details about his meeting with Secretary General NATO. "It's important that we have a good relationship, and the alliance countries are working to increase defense spending. We discussed the necessary means and solutions with the president to provide better protection for people from Russian attacks and to strengthen our positions. We are ready to work as productively as possible to achieve peace. We agreed to catch up more often by the phone and to coordinate our steps in the future as well. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, America." Now, what does this mean for Ukraine? And what do I think of this move? Okay, so first, what does this mean for Ukraine? $10 billion weapons sale is substantial, and it is the largest weapons pathway at all that Trump has offered for the Ukrainians. And the fact that it's being talked about as phase one indicates that the $10 billion might not be the end of it, depending upon how the wars goes, and of course, the possibility of miracle negotiations in the near future, as for the foreseeable future, there is no pathway for negotiation. So that means that artillery shells for 155 millimeter systems, that means like for the M777 howitzer and other NATO standard artillery systems, they can continue to see artillery shells coming from Scranton, Pennsylvania. Once the Biden, aid packages that were approved, supplementals that were approved, continue to whittle down and go away. This offers a pathway for those shells to continue to be shipped over, and possibly even a surge of the shells that are going there right now, because, you know, we're sending a certain amount of shells, yes, but it's only those from the supplementals passed from the last administration, and those have continued to dwindle and will continue to dwindle with time. So that means more artillery shells for Ukrainian artillery crews at a time when the Russians are prioritizing infantry assaults along the front line. On the Pokrovsk front, the way that the Russians are advancing is by surging artillery through ATVs, motorcycles, golf carts. They make frontline assaults, get to the trench, and then try to overwhelm the Ukrainians with overwhelming numbers. Now, the odds of whether or not those Ukrainians can hold the line are determined on a bunch of factors. Not only the morale of those holding those contact line positions, not only the skill and the aim of those in those positions, trying to, fire upon those coming in, whether or not they got grenades or, other, tools in tool belt, not even just whether or not their trench is well dug and well made, which of course is another factor, but also the pounding that the assaulting forces take on the way in. One way that the Ukrainians have dealt with the ammunition shortage and not having enough artillery to bring down upon those advancing forces has been by just swarming the battlefield with drones, swarming it with drones. Ukraine is the only American ally that has as much experience with drone warfare as it does. And it is probably the most drone experienced country on the planet when it comes to drone warfare, with the only other country being really the Russians. And I don't think the Russians are that willing to share that technology with the United States. Just going to put that forward. So they've been able to hold the line by replacing the artillery shortage with a massive drones. But if they have the massive drones and more shells, That means that the advances that the Russians have been experiencing will have to go through not only the smaller amount of mortars, artillery fire, and mass amount of drones, but also the mass amount of drones and much more artillery shells, mortar shells, and shrapnel fire that's going to be directing towards these assaults. So that means more casualties before they reach the line of contact, and that instead of seeing maybe 20 Russians making it out of a 30-person assault, maybe they'll see 12 or 10 or 8, because there'll be shells on top of the drones that will be responding and the drone teams that will be responding. This is also true when it comes to GLMRS rockets. And this is also true when it comes to the maintenance equipment that will be provided for a whole host of gear. When it comes to the interceptors, these interceptors, the Patriots, these are not used for one of the more publicized threats against Ukraine, the drones. Using a Patriot interceptor against a Shahed drone is a waste of resources. Do not do it. Do not do it. Do not do it. Shaheds can be taken down by M2 Brownings. Shaheds can be taken down by Maxim machine guns. Shaheds have even been taken down by DP-27s, for God's sakes. Now, if they get faster and there's jet Shaheds, it's going to be more difficult. Even sometimes for the Gepards to take them out. The German Gepard systems, which have much higher caliber shells and put down a very high rate of fire against the Shaheds, and they have a very, very, very good proven track record in taking them down, that German air defense system. So those can take them out at much lower cost, and there isn't a limited supply of them. The Patriot interceptors is one of the few air defense systems at Ukraine's disposal that can shoot down Russian ballistic missiles, Russian cruise missiles, even proven on one occasion at least, shooting down a hypersonic missile. It is only because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that we even know that Patriots can shoot down hypersonic missiles. And as it's continued to gather more information from shooting down these missiles, the Patriots have continued to improve, which have helped the Ukrainians by having better Patriots, and has helped the United States in improving its air defense systems with the most real-time data on these systems that it has ever gotten from the constant attacks that the Russians have been laying upon them. So these Patriot interceptors will give them more tools in the tool belt to take out the ballistic missiles that have hit not only civilian infrastructure, as we described before, of course, the very famous bombing of that Ukrainian children's cancer ward was extremely notorious, but also Ukrainian energy production, also Ukrainian weapons production and defense production, also Ukrainian, Ukrainian logistical points, Ukrainian training centers, whatever it might be, Ukrainian air bases. By having these ballistic missiles, they can help protect the foundation of which Ukraine arms itself, by which Ukraine defends itself. Its logistics, its supply, its factories, and its air bases, which have helped to deny the Russians the air superiority that they would have needed for their dreamed quick special military operation that they engaged in at the start. So, will this be helpful to the Ukrainians? Absolutely. It'll be helpful when it comes to artillery ammunition. It'll be helpful when it comes to interceptors. It'll be helpful when it comes to finding an avenue for continued supply munitions from the United States, as European defense production simply does not have the capacity to completely take up the artillery production that the United States can provide, and certainly is nowhere even close to being able to cover the extent that the United States is necessary, honestly, when it comes to providing the air defense interceptors. I mean, even if all of Europe gives Ukraine like half of their interceptor systems, Ukraine is still going to need a steady supply of interceptors, the actual missiles fired to shoot down these ballistic missiles. So these are the things that this $10 billion weapons package, if it really goes through and there's no last second Donald Trump, wait a moment, I saw that this Ukrainian MP called me cringe, and he doesn't like flip in the middle of the night. If the ship flies and sails smoothly, that is what we can see that this not aid package, oh boy, don't want to use that dirty word. That's a dirty word now. But this weapons deal does for Ukraine. Now, what does this fail to do? Again, if you paired this with sanctions that came into effect right now or as soon as possible, which then came with the threat of further sanctions, I think that would up the pressure. If it was, hey, we're going to go with 100% secondary sanctions now, and in 50 days it'll be 200%, then I think that strategy of the 50-day deadline might make sense for building pressure and building pressure on the Russians to come up with something quicker. If the United States came out and clarified that there will be a second phase, it's not just phase one, like which already emphasizes going to be a second phase, but saying phase two will be bigger. Not that, oh, there'll be phase one and then phase two will be 5 billion and then phase three will be 3 billion or 4 billion. But if you say phase two will be bigger, then the Russians have to think, oh, maybe next time instead of 10 billion, it'll be 20. And then we're going to amounts that are somewhat comparable to the supplementals that helped Ukraine in the fight before. It drags out the deadlines for how they could achieve military objectives and raises the pain for the advancing soldiers on the battlefield, which are costing the Russians more to recruit and are costing them more in personnel to advance. This is according to not only the Ukrainians, but this is also according to the American Secretary of State and to those who are doing public listings of Russian casualties. There are escalations when it comes to these big offensives on places like Pokrovsk, and their need to mass infantry and attack in order to overwhelm Ukrainian positions, while it does succeed in advancing forward in incremental amounts that stack with time to eventually possibly become encirclements of cities like Pokrovsk, it comes with an immense cost that is not endlessly sustainable. And if it became clear that that cost would continue to rise, and that the financial costs of conducting the war would continue to rise, and that it was treated with seriousness, and that they couldn't just hope for Taco Trump, that in 50 days it will become another 2-week deadline, or another 100-day deadline, or even another 24-hour deadline, that a deadline is a deadline, and it's not Obama Syria red line, it is a serious deadline. And that you need to treat it as seriously as a Japanese diplomat talking to Curtis LeMay, okay? You need it needs to have that feeling. It has to have that feeling that it is going to be delivered by Donald Trump. It is going to happen. And the fact that I'm talking about even the thing that they've already agreed to as, well, maybe Trump will stay on path, well, maybe they won't. The Russians still invest so much in the idea that the West doesn't have follow through, that we'll get distracted, that we got, well, they say like the Zoomers are the TikTok generation. We got like TikTok attention span, Subway Surfer, like so we got to put Subway Surfer stuff like side profiles on the PowerPoint presentations on the war when presenting to our leaders. We know that Kash Patel is disinterested when it comes to his briefings, and he's wanted to shorten the amount of briefings that he's having. We know that in the past, Donald Trump has had problem with paying attention during briefings, and we know Donald Trump has taken in inflows of information that is not true, like the encirclement and curse that the Russians told him and tricked him about. So I'm even uncertain about whether this weapons deal is going to go through. I think it probably is, but that lack of certainty allows the Russians to see pathways to the final victory, where Ukraine crumbles and Russia remains victorious in their head. Because all they have to do is wait for Trump to lose his concentration. All they have to do is wait for Trump to flip-flop again and change his mind. All you have to do is wait for the West to lose focus. And so this being managed by NATO, I think partially deals with that, because NATO as a collective has more of an interest than Trump does personally in continuing to see this flow of supplies to Ukraine, but without direct action until a trigger is pulled with seriousness on the sanctions bill, and these weapons start having a real effect on the front, and they hear something about a serious second wave. I still think it's going to be a bit until the Russians really recalculate. I think maybe they've started the process of starting to think about recalculation, as in, hey, what would be necessary? What would really hurt us here? What is the pathway that would make this untenable? But not as a, hey, this is happening, but as a, well, could Trump take that pathway? And so it needs to be, Trump is taking that pathway. We are now faced with an unwinnable war. What do we do? And until Trump faces them with that in cold, hard text, cold, hard legislation passing the Senate, signed by the President of the United States, until Trump goes out there and does it, they're always going to hope that Trump can go out there and blow it. Thoughts on the Lex Fridman scandal? There's a Lex Fridman scandal? I didn't know there was a Lex Fridman scandal.